If you want to go ahead and get started.
Okay, thanks, Taylor. Good evening, everybody. This is Mark Varian, one of the archaeologists here at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. I want to welcome you to our Thursday webinar. Tonight's webinar is the second of a two-part series. If you missed the one last Thursday, you can go to Crow Canyon's YouTube site and watch it. It was fantastic. Lyle and Craig did a really great job. The title of the webinar is The Memory of Water, Elements and Ancestry in the Bear's Ears. And it's led by Craig Childs and Lyle Balenquah. We want to begin by acknowledging that the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center rests on the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache. We acknowledge those people on whose traditional homelands our institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Our mission-related work wouldn't be possible without the Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. So we want to respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports actions to preserve and protect cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Our mission is to empower the present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. There's our website address at the bottom, crowcanyon.org. If you've never been on our website, it's really fantastic. There's lots of educational materials. We publish all of our research on the website. There's a lot of educational materials with native voices. So it's a rich website to explore. If you've never been here, that's a picture of our campus with the iconic Sleeping Ute Mountain in the background. We're located just outside of Cortez, Colorado, in Southwest Colorado. Welcome to Zoom conferencing. You can move the talking heads over to one side. The main thing is that we request that you put your questions to us for Kyle or for Lyle and Craig to take at the end of the presentation by using the Q&A button and not the chat. We'll try to get to all your questions, although sometimes we can't do that, but we'll do our best. If you're having trouble with your Zoom, you can head over and we're live streaming this webinar on Crow Canyon's Facebook page at that address, crowcanyon.org/Facebook. Also subscribe to us on YouTube. We publish all of our webinars there. So there's several years of really outstanding presentations on Crow Canyon's YouTube channel. We do these webinars every Thursday. Probably most of you know that, but the next two webinars that we're going to see, the one next Thursday is co-presented with the Hisatsinom chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society, our local CAS chapter, and it's titled Hidden Cities, Ancient Pueblos, Southeast Mounds, and Southwest Ruins Considered, and it's with Dr. Steve Lexon. So it'll be examining both the deep history of the Southwest and the Southeast, including famous sites like Cahokia. That'll be next Thursday, March 24th. Then the Thursday after that, on March 31st, the presentation will be Dene Navajo Resistance to U.S. Indian Commissioner John Collier's Livestock Reduction Program, which occurred 1937 to 1959, incredibly controversial and hurtful episode, and that's with Dr. Jennifer Dinnett-Dale. So I hope you tune in for both of those upcoming webinars. So that brings us to our program tonight, The Memory of Water, Elements and Ancestry in the Bear's Ears. The two scholars are Lyle Balenquah, who is a Hopi and member of the Hopi Greasewood clan and resides in the Hopi village of Bakavi on Third Mesa, which is located in northeastern Arizona. Lyle works as an archaeologist as well as a river and hiking guide across the Four Corners region. And through his work, he advocates for the protection and preservation of ancestral landscapes and combines his professional training with his personal experience and insights about Hopi culture and history. And we're just extremely lucky to have Lyle for this program tonight and for other programs at Crow Canyon. We're also lucky to have Craig Childs, a critically acclaimed and award-winning author of over a dozen books. Craig writes about the relationship between human beings, animals, landscapes, and time, and he's followed ancient Pueblo passages on foot across the Southwest. His stories come from his personal experiences, ranging from journeys into the deep wilderness to conversations with illicit artifact dealers. His most recent book is Virga and Bone, Essays from Dry Places. So really grateful that Craig is joining us tonight too. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I also want to thank Taylor Hasbrook, who runs the logistics of these webinars, and Laura Brown, who's the Crow Canyon person and filmmaker who created the film that we're going to see tonight. So thank you very much, Taylor and Laura, for your contributions to tonight's program too.
Crow Canyon ran a base camp trip in Bears Ears last fall, and for the desert, conditions were incredible. All summer, we'd had powerful monsoons, day after day with blue belly clouds and deluges, and weeks of flash floods. I can't think of one canyon or drainage that I saw where I didn't find fresh flood debris, which meant a second and third bloom of flowers come fall. I don't know how many years it's been since we've seen it like this. By day, we walked cliff bottoms and washes. Scholars came in and talked. Here, Becky Hammond from Ute Mountain Ute looks at a unique rock art panel of a Ute warrior on horseback. The horse faces what appears to be a plumed serpent. It could be a meeting of different traditions. The horse and rider are Ute, and the serpent could be related to Pueblo ancestry, which leaves you wondering what a panel like this would have meant when it was made, how long these traditions have been woven together. Hopi archaeologist Lyle Balenquah was on the trip, and we stopped at a cliff dwelling where he had been working. He'd been mapping, measuring, assessing, and he was able to see this stone and mortar village through dimensions of time, how it grew, how it collapsed, and how for a while it grew again. The pictographs painted on the back of the alcove relate specifically to Hopi clan history. They are not indecipherable symbols. They mean something.
Artifacts came out of this site, sandals. I think Tamara also informed me that I think 10 pairs of sandals.
We explored architecture and time sequences, which rooms were built onto which rooms. You can see where chambers were later joined, a difference in mortar and stacking. Doorways tell stories. You don't go through them. You only look, not touching the stone or the delicate mortar, only reaching out a camera to see inside. Is it ethical? We try to keep our footprint down. Is it needed? I think it's important to make some kind of connection with physical ancestry in a place, to be respectful of it, not touching its fragile parts, standing back most of the time, watching and listening. I got this clip several years ago in Bears Ears. It's a flash flood down White Canyon. I love this kind of event. Water, it appears in the desert, it's roaring down a canyon, the whole place comes alive. Just before the Crow Canyon group came out last fall, a flash flood like this blew out a bridge on Highway 95 crossing Cottonwood Wash. For months the highway was closed and we took a back road getting here. bypassing where the bridge was out, and we set a base camp at the mouth of a canyon. No one else was around because of the bridge. Thanks, flash floods. I was on this Crow Canyon course because of my experience with the land, my attachments to elements, and my background as an author and a field instructor. When it rains out here, like many, I feel it in my blood. It's our first night. We're in Blanding, Utah, and we'll be out in the backcountry tomorrow. But tonight, it's raining. Everything out here revolves around rain. That is the one crucial element of this place. Either rain or the absence of rain. And tonight, it's rain. That summer, I spoke with a Zuni farmer in New Mexico who told me fields were being washed out by floods. People's houses were wrecked. Roads were gone. I asked if he ever wished for rain to stop, and he laughed. Not around here, you never ask for it to stop, he said. He told me it's almost exhausting how much culturally a Zuni person or a Pueblo person thinks about precipitation. He said you go to bed thinking about clouds and rain. You wake up thinking about clouds and rain. The prayers and dances, what are they all about? Clouds and rain. The focus of our trip was ancestry and water. We'd stop to look across the desert for green patches in the boulders, a sign of a spring, a little seep, any form of moisture. I want to turn this over for a moment to the voice of Dr. Susan Ryan, head of field research at Crow Canyon. Most of her work is around Mesa Verde in Colorado, and I asked her to explain how water plays a role in the archaeological record.
As is true for humans across the world, occupation in the central Mesa Verde region was only possible because of an adequate and accessible supply of water. Water was the single most important natural resource for the residents of this landscape. Two forms of water were required: domestic water and precipitation for crops. Domestic water was needed for drinking, pottery production, cooking, and construction activities. Precipitation for crops was needed to meet the requirements of dry land farming plants, such as maize, beans, and squash. The occupation of this landscape was made possible by the existence of natural springs. Most springs in the Mesa Verde region are fed by an aquifer system. Precipitation on the ground surface, in the form of rain or snow, infiltrates the soils and the fissures in the sandstone bedrock and percolates downward until it reaches a relatively impermeable shale layer. The water then flows by gravity to an opening where a spring results. It takes approximately a decade for groundwater to be turned into spring water. Hopi community members are known to have significantly increased the volume of water from springs by keeping the area free of vegetation and sediment. In years with lower than normal precipitation, residents could have dug a shallow depression in the bottom of a drainage downslope from a spring to access subsurface water. Today, the Mesa Verde region receives a little more than 11 inches of precipitation annually, yet paleohydraulic studies suggest that precipitation values in the 13th century were higher, receiving about 16 inches of precipitation per year. Crops that are dependent on dry land precipitation requires a minimum of 10 inches of rain or snow annually, but successful crops are more likely to be raised with precipitation values of 20 inches or more. Because rivers and streams were not located near fertile agricultural land to allow for formal irrigation, the skillful management of moisture from direct precipitation was essential for raising crops to maturity in the central Mesa Verde region. Such management included the careful selection of locations for crop fields and the construction of check dams. Crops were often planted in the direct path of runoff, and check dams were constructed where necessary to slow runoff, which allowed maximal infiltration of the moisture into the ground surface. Check dams were important in other ways too, including the slowing of nitrogen replenishing organic materials and fine-grained sediments to collect over the fields to renew and fertilize them. Data indicate that water management strategies, such as check dams, increased in number and variety in the Mesa Verde region during the late Pueblo II period, or approximately AD 1050 to 1150, a trend that continued until regional depopulation in the late AD 1200s.
This is a cultural landscape. It is a map of human endeavors dating back thousands of years. There are reservoirs, check dams, dwellings, granaries, great houses, and processional roads. Rock faces are storied with petroglyphs and pictographs. Lyle Balenquah took us out to a Hopi ancestral marker in the southern reaches of the monument. I might have walked right by it, thought it was another random stone circle, but there's no such thing as a random stone circle. That's what you learn out here. We won't show a picture of the marker itself, but here's a piece of pottery we found on the ground nearby, proof it was on some kind of pilgrimage, returning to where the people had once lived. In a potsherd, you can see who left it, or at least who they were trading with. You'll see Mesa Verde ware, or something more red, probably brought in from the Canyon region in Arizona. It's why you leave them on the ground where you find them. Let them keep telling their story in that place. What we found at the ancestral marker was small but diagnostic. It's a piece of yellowware, which comes from the Hopi mesas in Arizona, where coal was historically used for firing ceramics. This created a unique yellow oxidization. The sherd came from a vessel from the Hopi mesas more than 100 miles south of here at a different time than when Pueblo people occupied this region. That means Hopi people were returning and left potsherds at this place, marking it on an ancestral cultural map.
Here, this is something that is like just yesterday for us, right? So it's still a memory that we retain of our connection to this landscape. We look at things like this, the ceramics, as verification that we've retained that knowledge, that Hopi people have since been making pilgrimages back to an ancestral landscape to honor ancestors before, bringing pottery and other offerings, in tribute to pay their respects. And so there's little features like this all across the landscape that as Hopi people we look for. Those are the, I talked about archaeology sites being the footprints of Hopi ancestors. These are the breadcrumbs that we're literally following back in time, right? We're able to come back out and see the physical proof of not just what happened 1,000 years ago, but perhaps maybe within 100, 200 years of Hopi people coming back up into this landscape and paying homage back to their ancestors, perhaps coming back up to gather resources that are unique to this area. So this is just an important part that we've really started to pick
Migration
up on.
routes have a lot to do with water. Rock art is gathered around springs, and springs form routes of travel, stopovers along pilgrimages or trade routes. I have a question for Balenquah, something we talked about in the field but we don't have on film. How do springs play into Hopi traditions?
It's just another way for us to continue to...
We are of water, and the water is of us. When water is threatened, all living things are threatened. What we do to water, we do to ourselves. There exists a unique connection between Hopi culture and water, including springs. This connection cannot be easily explained in terms of geologic formation and hydrological processes. Hopi people believe water is a divine gift from the ancestors. The phenomena of naturally occurring springs are proof to Hopi people that greater forces exist in the physical world we inhabit. Springs are considered to be living entities that breathe and exhale moisture, a metaphysical connection between the spiritual world of ancestors and the natural world of their descendants. The life-sustaining waters that issue forth are a precious resource, allowing Hopi people and their ancestors to survive within a desert environment. Springs are key components of a Hopi cultural landscape, one that is imbued with the history of a living culture such as Hopi. Many springs are recalled in Hopi oral histories, songs, and prayers. To this day, water is collected from springs, some from great distances, and used within ceremonies back at Hopi. The riparian environment associated with springs and other water sources are also considered culturally important. Specific springs are visited to collect plants, minerals, and pigments for use by Hopi people. In ancestral and historic times, springs drew people together, often being the place where villages were built, such as my home village of Bakavi, or Reed Springs Place, located on 3rd Mesa. When a prolonged drought occurred across the Southwest in the late 12th century, many ancestral Hopi clans migrated to areas where more reliable springs could be found, including the southern Black Mesa area where the Hopi villages are located. Hopi people believe that water under the ground has much to do with rain clouds. Everything depends upon the proper balance being maintained. The water under the ground acts like a magnet, attracting rain from the clouds, and the rain in the clouds acts as a magnet, raising the water table under the ground to the roots of our crops and plants. The granting of life from one world to another is honored with ceremonial offerings left at springs. Hopi anthropologist Farrell Sikiakuku states, "Every time we go out to pray and leave offerings, we also go to a spring, because the spring is very important and represents the bloodline of the earth, who is our mother."
You start thinking about everything in terms of water. To live here means to adapt, to be a creature of water surrounded by drought, punctuated with occasional rains. Some places are wet and some are dry. Everything living here weaves between these two extremes.
More you see moving water, because down here it gets into deeper sediments and it tends to sink under the surface. But this is
the first time I've been here in a long time that has not been flowing.
That's curious that it's not.
We explored hills made of rubble. These are ruined great houses from a time when more people lived in the Four Corners than live here now, rising and falling and rising on the same range of rainfall we see today. Water is part of culture. When I see rock art, I often think I'm seeing prayers or nods to water. Some of the big anthropomorphs might not be representations of normal human people, but rather personifications of clouds. Carol Patterson, a Crow Canyon archaeological scholar who specializes in rock art, told me that I needed to put myself in the mindset of an animistic culture living here for thousands of years. Drawing a cloud, you wouldn't make it puffy and round. You'd make it into a person. So you can see the multiple tiers on top of that one up there, on top of the head. And those may represent big leather rattles that have been found, booming rattles that either were worn as a headdress or that were carried on a staff and could be shaken and make the sound of thunder. And you see that a lot. You see that up in the canyons north of here, where there are figures with multiple tiers on top of their heads, and over on the San Juan, all these figures with these big rattles that they're, you can just imagine them shaking them and just making this booming sound that's kind of calling the thunder and calling the rain. I talked with a group of Hopi elders in a meeting room almost 2 decades ago, explaining that I was working on archaeology and a personal understanding of an ancient civilization, one to which they belonged. One of them said, "So you're writing fiction?" No matter how much science is involved, yes, to a degree you're making it up. You're imagining the past. I don't have the bloodlines or the traditions myself that might fill in the picture, but I do see outlines in the ground. You'll find that you sit in the same places where they sat, where someone flaked stone to make a tool, and the flakes are still in an arc on the ground 1,000 or more years later. The line between fiction and nonfiction blurs. You walk under the ground and you begin to see the past.
Well, that was fantastic. Thanks again to Laura Brown, who made that film, and to Craig and Lyle for their work in it. We're happy to take questions if people want to write some into the Q&A. Don't have any so far, but I've got a question for Craig to start with. Craig, where was the first time you saw an archaeological site and how old were you?
First time seeing an archaeological site. Probably in my memory, it's probably 8 years old or so in the Sonoran Desert. I probably saw things before that, but I remember being out quail hunting with my dad in central Arizona and following him through the washes, and then we came on pieces of hohokam, kind of the reddish brown pottery of the hohokam area in the Sonoran Desert, and so there were like 100 little potsherds on the ground, and I remember my dad just telling me, "Oh, this is stuff that's old," and I don't think I had a concept of age other than us, our months and weeks of living, and it really struck me that he said, "Oh, this isn't ours. This is somebody else. This is a long time ago. This is ghost material," and I just remember that so clearly, and the way he saw it as a time that is just very different from what we're in right now, and so I imagined another world maybe for the first time.
So Lyle, I'm guessing you were even younger than Craig when you saw your first archaeological site, and that you maybe didn't even think of it as an archaeological site, and that if you were with a grandparent or a parent, I'm curious how they talked to you about what you were seeing.
Yeah. Running across the material culture. So I probably from the day I was born and allowed outside, after however many days I was allowed out, archaeology is around us. And so, it really depends in terms of at which level or which age I think I was at, in terms of the amount of information that was given to me. So it depends. Sometimes they would tell me some specific history, sometimes it was kind of vague, but yeah, they still maintain knowledge. Growing up around here on Third Mesa, around the village, we could go exploring a lot, and we'd come back at the end of the day and sit around the dinner table with the extended family, and they'd ask us where we had gone and what had we seen. And it was during those times, we'd tell them about either the springs or some other archaeological site, some rock art panel that we had been to. And, throughout that time, they would share some information there. So, it would come and go in terms of, specific information related to certain sites, but also just general and broad information taught throughout the years.
Yeah, thank you. Somebody asked about the springs at Cottonwood Wash, which is in the Bears Ears area, and whether they are more active or potent or less active or potent now than in the past. Do y'all have any sense of that?
I haven't noticed a lot of changes. There are some springs that I've gone back to for quite a few years, and they change seasonally. I haven't noticed them dropping down to a level where they're not flowing anymore. And it's hard to tell how old some of these springs are, because some springs, they respond to weather changes. So you get a rain and within days the spring level changes, or other springs are more
decadal or century based or thousands of years. Some springs have been had their organic material radiocarbon dated back to 15,000 years old. So the springs are really tapping into different ages of water coming in, of recharge, and I haven't seen a dramatic change, but I think you kind of need to stay there watching them for decades to really get a sense of rhythm, which is why I think, you go back to people who lived there for so long, they would have known every spring how it changes in relation to weather and climate, the bigger changes. So I feel like my knowledge, even though I pay a lot of attention, is still cursory. I'm still just passing through.
Thanks, Craig. Somebody wrote in and quoted what one of you said. I can't remember if it was Craig or Lyle. You had the phrase that we're creatures of water surrounded by drought. And they asked, so I'm putting this to Lyle. They asked, how can older ways of living, indigenous ways of living, inform our current experiences of water? Is there things that the way indigenous people and Hopi people think about water that could better inform all of us about water today?
Yeah, and I'm gonna leave my video off. Hopefully that'll help my audio. But there's been a lot of information shared, I think, from the Hopi side and other indigenous folks about the need to conserve water, and how we view it more as like I stated, a living entity versus just the resource. So there's a lot of history that Hopi has about droughts in terms of how we've survived that. But again, it comes down to this idea of respect. I think and I've given these webinars a lot of thought about what is the intent and the message. What are some of the messages we're trying to convey to everybody out there? And I think one of the messages I hope that comes across is a message of respect for water and everything else, on the landscape. We're looking at this as a holistic, environment out there. And so it's hard to single one thing out. And I think we all are aware, hopefully we are aware of the overuse and abuse of water, in our modern day municipalities, our cities, perhaps our own usage. It's a lot of this is incumbent upon us to be aware of our own individual uses and how we are, helping to address this issue. So that message of respect, can have a lot of different ways it can be implemented within conservation methods, and again, just elevating water to a higher level, versus just something that we need and use. I don't know how much more indigenous people can continue to say that, water is life, and yet we still continue to ignore that philosophy. I mean, 3 simple words, water is life, contain a lot of meaning for everybody. And so it's very, disheartening sometimes when that kind of, we're continually trying to re-educate not only ourselves, but those around us about respecting water, looking for better ways to manage and conserve it. Just north of me here, about 60 miles, there's a giant pond that's drying up. That pond used to be called Lake Powell. And who knows if we're going to call it Lake Powell anymore. Maybe that's a good thing, but that should be a clear indication of, the situation we're all in right now. And so when it comes to the indigenous perspective, yes, I think we just need to look at water in a different perspective and give it the due respect and recognize, that yes, within indigenous cultures, we have a lot of philosophy of conservation. Again, it's difficult to, implement that sometimes, but I don't think that that stance will never go away. So hopefully, you get an idea that we are encouraging overall respect for this resource.
Well, along those same lines, Kyle, somebody was impressed with a quote of yours from the film that was, "What we do to the water, we do to ourselves." And they wondered if that was your quote or if you got that from somebody else.
Yeah, that opening statement, I was that whole statement that I read was previous writing from another kind of water forum that I was involved in. But that opening quote is from a water gathering that was held by some nonprofits and some individual community members out here at Hopi, probably the early 2000s. And so opening statement is kind of a collective philosophy of Hopi individuals contributing, their ideas, and then, it being turned into, that kind of statement. So a lot of the concepts that I talked about within that statement that I spoke in, those ideas and philosophies were generated from many different conversations held with individual Hopi members here, some elders, some younger, scientists, general community members, a lot of farmers, ranchers. So those statements convey, I think, what a lot of different Hopi perspectives would, talk about.
There was a recent publication that got a lot of attention in the media. The lead author was a climate scientist named Park Williams, and he presented data to say that the current mega drought from 2000 to now is the driest of all the mega droughts in the last 2,000 years. Now, there are ones that were not as dry overall, but had more consecutive dry years. And I think that's true for the mega drought of the late AD 1200s. But people have written in wondering about global climate change. And if you all, in your experience on the landscape, if you can see its effect on the landscape and on water in the landscape.
Well, it's a long, slow change in a way, because we're dealing with, it's been snowing the last few weeks, and so our spirits are all lifted because, even though we're inside of this deep drought, you see a good a snowpack show up, and you think, oh, good, we're saved, and yeah, we get a little boost, but that report you're referencing, Mark, that I think there are a lot of other studies that are showing the same thing, that we're in the midst of a significant drought, what would now be termed a mega drought, and seeing it on the land, yeah, just where I live in Southwest Colorado, there's a creek that flows several hundred feet down below my house and in the canyon bottom, and I moved there probably 7 years ago, and then I think 3 years ago in the summer, the creek stopped flowing, and I'd never seen that before. So I went to the people who owned the house before me and talked to them, and they said that creek had been flowing for 25 years. I talked to other people in the area. They said they never knew it to stop. And now, for I think 3 summers, it doesn't flow. It's completely dry. And so just that one observation on one creek tells me that it's not just the effect of direct precipitation, but also of who has senior water rights upstream because they're tapping them, because their other sources have gone out. So it's kind of a cascade. So yeah, I'm seeing an effect just on that one creek. I know that there are springs, not necessarily in the Cottonwood Creek area where we were talking about in the webinar there, but across the Colorado Plateau, creeks that I have seen, or springs that I've seen change over the last 15 years, getting smaller over time. You can see the change, but then you get like last fall, we had an incredible monsoon season, and man, the Russian thistle was just going crazy. The desert was green with fresh tumbleweeds, and flowers were coming up, and life was coming up all around us on that trip, and so you get these moments where it feels like you're getting a breath from the drought, but really we're in a big one, and we're getting just these spells of relief. And I think that's that is what it means to live in a desert. We live in a place of drought. So what is unusual is getting the big rains.
Right. We know from tree ring studies that there were terrible droughts in the past too. And Lyle, I'm curious whether Hopi oral history, if the stories talk about droughts and the effects of droughts on Hopi people.
There's some oral history about more recent, not just droughts, but other calamities, I guess, pandemics, things of that nature. But yes, when it comes to droughts, it's nothing new for Hopi people. It's something that we've expected and kind of always in the back mind, of a Hopi person about how are we going to sustain ourselves into the future. And so, there's a good knowledge about Hopi people, keeping at least 4 years of corn in storage in preparation for these drought times, and just again having a good understanding of the landscape. Droughts have forced a lot of folks to move around, so there are oral histories about different villages moving, entire populations moving to relatives, in the eastern pueblos and other areas, and residing there for a while until things got better. And so Pueblo history has a long association with following and chasing and trying to bring in moisture and water in some form or another. And so droughts are just a part of the cycle, I think, that we understand happens, and sometimes, I think for the past 10 years or more, we've had many climate scientists come to Hopi and ask us, at least two questions. The first question is, are we aware of climate change? And two, what are we going to do about it? Because as if we have a magic, solution for how to cure, the ills of climate change and that kind of issue. So the latest, drought that we are going through is not unfamiliar for us. It's definitely been long and something that we've all been talking a lot about, for the past 10 years or more. So we recognize it. I guess we rely on some of those philosophies and teachings about preservation and conservation, and hope that they get us through till whenever this breaks, but I don't know if we're at the end of it, near the end of it, so we just have to kind of see what Mother Nature holds in store for us.
Well, with the exception of the village of Moenkopi that does irrigate, most Hopi farming is dry farming, where it's just farming from the moisture that falls from the skies. Are there techniques that Hopi people have developed to cope with drought and to still be able to harvest crops during dry years?
There's a variety of farming techniques, so generally a lot of Hopi farmers they may diversify their crop locations, so over a general landscape, or even within your main planting area, you may have you probably have an understanding of areas that retain moisture even during really dry times, and so for my family personally, we know that there are certain fields that we have that will retain moisture even though other areas are pretty bone dry, and so we'll still continue to plant in those areas. There's some soil retention kind of practices about adding vegetation, brush rows
to conserve, the top layers of soil. But really, it's about the development of the crop itself. When we're talking about corn, and so corn is our biggest innovation against drought. In terms of how do we combat drought? We've selectively cultivated, our corn that we plant to be drought resistant, and so I think that's one coping mechanism. One way in which we've learned to deal with drought is recognizing that there are strains of corn that we have that do better in drier conditions. And so, there's different things we can do. We can shift our locations around. We can do things for the soil. We can add vegetation itself. But ultimately, I think we maintain our faith as our strongest adaptation, to whatever's coming our way.
Craig, I got a question for somebody who's spent a lot of time walking on Cedar Mesa. What are your impressions of water resources on Cedar Mesa, both up top on the mesa tops and in the canyons, and especially those canyons on the south end? How common are they? Are there other things besides springs where they captured water to use water? And what's the distance between these water sources that people would have had to survive on that landscape?
Well, there's really water everywhere up there. It's harder to find up high, up in the pinyon juniper zone. Where I go looking for water on Cedar Mesa is down over the lips, because down inside the canyons, that's where the canyons are basically cutting back into these perched aquifers inside of the mesa, and the farther back a canyon cuts, the more water it draws to that place. So there are a lot of springs inside the canyons. Looking at it from a distance, it looks dry and exposed, and there's just not that much water. But I think this is true across the desert Southwest in general, if you get down into the intricacy of the landscape, you start to find where the water is flowing, and you find that there are actually springs all over. You see the check dams up in these drainages, up in the pinyon juniper lands up top and down in the canyons, and that's, I don't see them so much as check dams gathering reservoirs like we think of now. I see them more as slowing the water for a moment and letting it sink into the ground. And the more you do that, the more check dams you have, the more swales you put on the land that slow the flow of rainwater or the melt of snow water, the better the springs are flowing underneath. And Lyle brought up something in the program there, saying that water underground extracts rain from the clouds, and it's granting life from one world to another. And as I'm listening to that, I'm thinking, oh, he's describing the hydrologic cycle, that the water underground is pulling from above. You think about the San Francisco peaks in Arizona, that's when you see the cumulus clouds rising over the peaks and those storms dropping water, that's recharge. That's the water from the sky recharging the water underground. And so you don't see it as, you get these glimpses of seeps and springs and places where the water comes out, but there's a much bigger system going on here of clouds dropping rain and snow onto the land, which recharges the aquifers and the groundwater, which brings out the springs, and there's just this, it's the hydrologic circles going on out there. And Cedar Mesa is recharged, a lot of it by the Abajo Mountains, and so I look to the Abajos, and I can see the Abajos from where I live. in Colorado, and I keep my eye on how white they are this time of year, how much snow is up there, and that will then tell me, well, what's this season going to look like down in Cedar Mesa.
Right. I think the check dams were also about increasing the soil depth, because the deeper the soils, the more they hold soil moisture for potential crops. So I think your comment about them was interesting. But do you see other ways of capturing water? This is for either one of you, on top of Cedar Mesa, including building reservoirs that would have held water?
Well, I don't know.
I ask because we do have those reservoirs over here in Southwest Colorado.
I don't know of any in particular, but that doesn't at all mean that they're not there. That would be a good question for Jonathan Till.
Right.
Send out into the ether. Somebody who's really looked at these sites, because there are reservoirs, as on Mesa Verde and this whole area around in Southwest Colorado, storage reservoirs, so actual surface water. Right. And your comment about the check dams, I've seen so many check dams that have like cottonwood groves growing in them because of all that sediment that's filled up behind them. And it really changes the landscape. It's remarkable to see, 1,000 years later, that you see a concentration of cottonwood trees and go, oh, that's there because somebody built a check dam 1,000 years ago. Right. And allowed sediment to gather there and allowed water to slow down. And so these alterations that were done, 800, 1,000 years ago are still affecting the hydrologic process on the surface and what grows there.
Thank you. Somebody wrote in and asked if either of you and I don't know if Lyle had something to add to that one, so jump in if you do, Lyle, but somebody wrote in and asked if you know and can speak about the purity of the water that comes from the springs.
It really depends on the formation. My favorite is the water coming out of Navajo sandstone, because it travels through all those tight quartz grains that are have just the right distance between them to make a perfect filter. And I've over time, I don't know if I could tell the taste difference, if you set them in front of me, but I can tell different formations, there are certain shale formations that tend to have more salt in them, more minerals. So it's really based on where the water is coming from. And I've talked to hydrologists, groundwater researchers in the Grand Canyon who are looking at where tracing springs in the Grand Canyon back to the surface, and they're finding a web of water flow that, a spring will access water that's coming from 1 mile away, and then another spring next to it will access water that's coming from 20 miles away. So it's really traveling through different terrain or different geology to get to one place. So I don't know if this is answering the question, but there's a significant difference from spring to spring, and some you can't drink, some are too mineralized or too salty. And you can tell sometimes by the plants that they grow around them, which ones you want to be drinking from and which ones you don't.
Lyle, it's amazing to visit Hopi and to see the springs that Hopi people have developed near the villages, and how maybe I'm wrong on this, but it seems like they've taken what would be a relatively small spring, and yet by the way they've developed it, turned it into quite a large pool. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how Hopi people have developed those springs, and how those developed springs near the villages are used today. Are they a source of drinking water, or is the water used for other things? Or Is it not even about using the water? Is it about something else?
The springs around here, around the villages, they can have multiple uses. So, and some have been utilized for probably over 1,000 years, so like the springs that are associated again with my village, we know from ceramics that are evident, some Black Mesa ceramics that at least 800 years or more, these springs have been used by various people. And so it just depends on the extent to which folks are choosing to use them. Some villages have built them up and have done a lot of improvement for the springs, maybe have cleaned out the areas in which it's coming out and built up stone masonry reservoirs. So there are some villages that have really nice stone masonry kind of terrace garden setup, around the springs themselves. So, I don't think that's too far from what, ancestral folks were doing as well, for these areas in terms of improving them and developing them for better usages. So you mentioned that for the most part, crops out here on Hopi are only dry farm, the corn, beans, squash. You can grow other crops, though, more well-watered crops around the springs. And so historically, like again, in my village, the women would tend to these little terrace gardens that were built up. And so you'd have like tomatoes or chilies or cilantro or other plants, growing in these areas. And again, each village is different. They all have their kind of maybe their garden committees that help maintain these areas. And so some, are more in use than others based on their output. I know the 3 springs here at my village, probably only one of them is really pumping out water at a decent rate right now. The other 2 are kind of iffy. And, that's kind of the effect right now around some of the other springs at the other villages. But yeah, so the community members still take pride in being able to utilize that water. They still are very culturally important. They have a lot of ceremonial and cultural significance associated with them, of course. And so, there's still that kind of cultural knowledge maintained about metaphorical ways in which we are taught to respect water, through, spiritual entities and things of that nature. So a lot of detailed information still maintained about springs and their uses here at Hopi. And so, we're fortunate to continue those traditions.
Lyle, did the huge coal mines to the north on Black Mesa affect the springs at Hopi?
We definitely feel that the underground pumping that Peabody Coal was doing for well over 40 years, they were pumping pristine aquifer water from underneath Black Mesa. This aquifer water is glacial. 1,000 years it's been dated, and so when we talk about quality of water, this is some of the most pristine water you'll find anywhere. And so, but there's different aquifers under Black Mesa, I should point out. And so those aquifers feed different springs throughout the area. Some of the more shallower springs people did notice they did dry up a lot faster in association with the underground pumping that Peabody was doing for that time frame. It's too soon, I think, right now to really know if that recharge is coming back. It's barely been about a decade, since some of the mining has stopped. More recently, all of it has stopped, but it'll take a long time before we really understand what the full impacts are and just how far reaching. We may think that they're localized in terms of being specific to Black Mesa, but there's hydrologists that believe that this could have impacts as far as the Grand Canyon and springs located along the Little Colorado River area. So these are not just really specific to one area. We have to take into consideration the wide-ranging impacts of all of this activity. So we're continuing to monitor springs out here at Hopi and across Black Mesa in general, and hopefully they'll start to recharge.
Thank you, Lyle. It's 5 o'clock, and I don't think I'm going to get to everybody's questions. I apologize for that, but I want to do a couple more if Craig and Lyle are willing. We won't go too far over because I know Craig has a speaking engagement tonight. But Craig, I wonder, we've talked about how humans on that Bears Ears landscape need water. How do the animals on that landscape relate to the springs? And have you had any of your well-known animal encounters associated with springs on that landscape?
Yeah, we focus on humans so much. I mean, obviously, we are them, but we're actually such a small part of what's happening on the land. And I I think that animals are something that we should have in our mind more often, because we're thinking about, farming and irrigating and coal mining and, human activities when we're one species, and there are so many others out there. And all you have to do is sit near a water source for a long time, and you'll see something come by. Nothing's coming to mind for a dramatic encounter on there in Bears Ears, but I've had plenty of encounters at springs and water holes. I came on a mountain lion once that was drinking from a water hole, and it was facing the opposite direction from me, so it didn't see me, and I was able to watch it for some time as it was just crouched at the edge of the water, and the way you could see the shoulder blades lifted up, on its back as it brought its mouth down to the water. And it was just an incredible, 30 seconds of being able to watch a mountain lion drink out of water hole. And that's when I wrote my book, The Secret Knowledge of Water. The title from that book came from when I was walking in the desert, and this would happen to be down in below the Chisos Mountains in Big Bend, West Texas, and I came on a really nice little water hole just as some white-tailed deer came on it from the other side, and we saw each other and they bounded away. And I thought, oh God, it's a long way to the next water out here. I scared them off, and I was writing about it in my journal. And I said, well, I don't know where the next water is, but those deer, they have the secret knowledge of water, and they'll be okay. And then I went, oh, there's a title. But I've get near water and watch, and that's where everything happens.
That's great. There's a question for both of you, or that either of you could respond to. Visitation has increased exponentially on the Bears Ears in the last decade, and have you noticed impacts to the water resources as a result of that increase in visitation?
Say something first. Not right offhand, but I'm not also accessing or looking at all the different water sources out there, so there are some springs that we visit in association with archaeological sites or other places out there. But for now, it seems that a lot of it or some being overused. I don't know a whole lot about what the livestock are doing just yet. So, just in general, I think they're still, being productive out there and not being impacted severely.
Thanks, Lyle.
For how much visitation has increased, and maybe it's just the nature of where I'm going in Bears Ears, I haven't seen that much more human impact. I've seen in certain places where people tend to go, I see more impact, but 99% of the landscape, I'm not really seeing that much human activity. And the water sources are so diverse and often small that I'm not seeing a direct impact from people visiting. You know, it would be different if there was a river, you know, a recreational river flowing through Bears Ears, but there's a San Juan River down inside of deep Gooseneck Canyon, so it's hard to get down to. So out there, you know, most of the impact I see is cattle up higher, and that really hasn't changed across my lifetime out there. It seems to be the same impact, and humans on the ground. I'm not really. I hear a lot about the impact, and I seem to see it focused in really specific places. So the backcountry still seems to be relatively unharmed.
Good to hear. Well, it's 5 after. I thought maybe we would close, and I do apologize to the people who I didn't get to your questions. Maybe we'll try and figure out a way to get those to Craig and Lyle to see if we can respond. But I thought we'd close. Both of you have new books that you're involved in. And Craig, do you want to talk about your new book? And then Lyle, you can talk about yours.
Sure thing. I happen to have it here.
Good.
This is my book, Tracing Time. Get it up there. It's called Seasons of Rock Art on the Colorado Plateau. And it's based on a lifetime around rock art, but it's focused particularly on about a year and a half of, I pitched this book in the pandemic because it seemed like I was going to have some time. And so I spent a year and a half really focused on rock art, sitting at a lot of panels, pictographs, petroglyphs, and watching the light change on them. It's not a photo book, it's a word book. It's all text with some illustrations, and some really nice illustrations, but I didn't want to use photos. I wanted to use somebody's handwork, because I wanted to have a reader experience it through words rather than visually. And then it's a book about ways of seeing rock art, not so much about what rock art means, more about here are different ways it's perceived from Hopi archaeologist to a Zuni farmer to obsessed rock art Anglo in Moab, to just all these different people. And what I'm trying to do is look at rock art and say, well, here's the sphere of perspectives, which should give us a better idea of how we can see it, and how to spend time, and how to slow down and witness rock art.
That's great. I can't wait to get my copy. Lyle, you have a new book too?
I should say it's not my book, but it's a book in which many of us here at Hopi have contributed to. There's a lot of press out there on it already. So really just a long-term project in terms of the amount of research, really detailing the history of Hopi collaborative research in documenting our own history here within the Southwest, but with a focus on the Hopi Mesa area. So it's available through the University of Arizona Press. We recently found out that it won one of the book awards for the SAAs, and then a couple other awards from some various other organizations. So we're fortunate that we've been able to put together some of this information, and be able to present it for everybody out there. So go out there, check it out. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, that for those of you that don't know, the SAA is the Society for American Archaeology, and that book won the Society for American Archaeology Scholarly Book Award, the best scholarly book in 2022. And I don't know if you want to say anything about this, Lyle, but to me, it epitomizes this fundamental change that's happening in archaeology, that where archaeology is being transformed by indigenous people like you who are practicing archaeology, and they call that indigenous archaeology. And this book is a great example of that collaboration. But I don't know if you have anything to say from your perspective about how archaeology is changed during the time that you've been practicing it because of the increased participation of indigenous people.
I should state that the book itself is a reflection more of people from the community here that we rely on, our own advisors,
right,
recommending that we produce work that is accessible to our own community members.
right.
And so that is the a driving philosophy, I guess, behind anything that Hopi is trying to do in terms of archaeology or ethnography and anthropology, those kind of fields, in terms, you know, how we're documenting our own history. We need to be able, so it's a bit ironic that it won a scholarly award when we were trying to be less scholarly with the book itself, you know, and make it accessible to our community members. So it's just that, though, the increase of indigenous individuals and presence to be able to tell our own histories and narratives, to be involved in the research as it's happening, not after the fact. You know, these are priorities for us, those of us that work in these areas, just to maintain the presence of indigenous culture and history here, you know, and that it has a priority, that it receives equal, if not more, attention and space within, you know, any kind of literature or published documentation out there. So there's a lot of different facets to what we are trying to achieve, but really it's about advocating for ourselves and recognize that we have a lot of diversity amongst our own tribal communities. And so it's up to us to step up and present those diverse, you know, perspectives and opinions versus relying on outsiders to always continually tell our story, which has inherent obstacles built into it. So we just want to be doing it ourselves, basically.
Right, that's great. Thank you so much, Lyle. All right, that brings us to the end of our program. I want to once again thank Taylor Hasbrook, who runs all the logistics of these webinars and does a fantastic job. Laura Brown, who made the film. That was so beautiful, Laura. Thank you so much for making it. And I want to especially thank Lyle and Craig, not only for the participation in this two-part webinar series, but for all you've done for Crow Canyon over the years. We're really grateful for your work and your partnership with us on our programs. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Hope you join us next Thursday for Steve Lexon and his webinar. Good night, everybody. Thank you.